Hello mortals, I am the goddess who created the text world of Listernia, and today I want to recommend some classic science fiction to you. Now I have chosen authors who started their careers in science fiction's golden age. Now keep in mind, I haven't read every golden age science fiction author or even all the books in the authors that I am mentioning. These are authors that I've chosen from books that I've read and are only representative of my opinions. If you have a favorite author from the golden age of science fiction, please let me know in the comments below because I'm curious to see what some of you may have read. That said, the 5 authors I picked include the so-called Big Three from science fiction's golden age: Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, and Arthur C. Clarke. And I've also chosen 2 more of my favorites, Ray Bradbury and Frederik Pohl. Now, do you notice something similar about these writers? They are all white men.
Say what?
And I hate that too, but you know what? It would have been disingenuous of me to throw in women or minority writers because they were not that prevalent during this time period. I didn't say they didn't exist, but we're just choosing from writers that I've happened to have read. And to be honest, white men pretty much ruled early science fiction. But we can't turn our backs on these writers just because they were white men. They were the originals. They did found the science fiction genre as we know it. The genre was, of course, embraced by women and minorities. It just may have taken more time. Now, I do want to do a video on some of the early women of science fiction, but that's not this video. So let's go back in time to the golden age of science fiction and define what is the golden age. The golden age is considered to be from 1938 to 1946, just after pulp science fiction like Edgar Rice Burroughs, who I love. I love John Carter of Mars. It's one of my favorites. But the pulps gave way to hard science fiction that put the emphasis on the science, or at least logic. Now, there weren't that many novels published during this time period, even up through the 1950s. So what did people read? Now, I want you to think about this because some of you read a dozen books a month, but what if there are only a dozen books published per year in the genre that you love? What would you do? Well, if you're reading science fiction and fantasy during the 30s, 40s, 50s, you'd probably turn to some of these magazines. Now, a lot of the early science fiction writers are known for their short stories. Why? Because they sold to these science fiction magazines. It was a lot more lucrative to write a short story and sell something in a month rather than going through the whole publishing process just for one novel. So a lot of the early science fiction authors may not be well known now, mostly because they were known for their short stories. Now, there are a lot of these monthly magazines out. Astounding, Amazing, Weird Tales, Galaxy. This is still being published, I believe, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And yes, I used to have a subscription to it, and they have articles by authors like Gene Wolfe, Ray Bradbury, Neil Gaiman. So a lot of really well-known authors as well as lesser-known authors. And like I said, there are a few still around now. And I remember when Omni was a big deal. It was a magazine of science fact. It was kind of like Wired, but it would always have 1 or 2 science fiction stories included in it. So in the 40s and 50s, there was a big demand for short stories, and that's why a lot of writers of that time focused on short stories. Some of these writers you may have heard of but never read because, again, their focus was on the short story form. One of those writers was Ray Bradbury, who was definitely known for his short stories more than his novels, in my opinion. He actually wrote very few novels. His most famous is probably Fahrenheit 451, but my favorite was Something Wicked This Way Comes. But that was more of a horror story. But my recommendation for Ray Bradbury is The Martian Chronicles, published in 1950. And it is a single story, but it is told through a series of short stories. And it's sometimes called a short story fix-up that stitches together a patchwork of short stories to make a novel. And they're all connected. And I believe The Martian Chronicles showcases Bradbury's talent as a short story writer. It is also a nice transition from pulp science fiction into the science fiction we know today. In fact, Bradbury cited Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars as a major inspiration for The Martian Chronicles. Bradbury is considered one of science fiction's literary writers because his writing is lyrical, almost like poetry, and it really evokes emotions. Now, the story arc of The Martian Chronicles recounts humans landing on Mars by spaceship, discovering a Martian civilization that wants nothing to do with humans. I don't want to say more, except consider when these stories were written, right after World War II, and how that influenced the writing. The second science fiction author is actually Ray Bradbury's mentor, Robert Heinlein. Did you know that Robert Heinlein coined the term speculative fiction? So whenever you use it or hear someone else use it, it is a term coined by Heinlein. And I absolutely love Heinlein, but he seems to have fallen out of favor. But back in the day, his books were eagerly awaited by all science fiction fans. But he was probably the most popular science fiction author in the 60s and the 80s. Now notice I did not say the 70s. That's because he had some major health issues that prevented him from publishing much of anything during the 70s. Now I remember when The Number of the Beast was published in 1980, after his long hiatus, everyone was so excited that
Heinlein is back, baby.
By the by, how everything kind of connects, the characters in The Number of the Beast are all in homage to Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars, including a character named John Carter and a character named Dejah Thoris. So why has Heinlein fallen out of favor? I think the issue with Heinlein for today's reader, and this is pure speculation on my part, he was a product of his time as someone who grew up during the 1920s, during the Depression, and served in the military. So he was one of those man's man, pull yourself up by the bootstraps type of man. There is no such thing as a free lunch type of man. And he was also fascinated by women, strong women, independent women, but he never could quite grok women. Grok, by the way, is a term that he created in the novel I'm about to recommend. And you hear the word grok come up, like Grok Nation.
So I have a website called Grok Nation, and I was like, this is the perfect thing to write about.
Grok Nation?
Grok Nation.
Oh, Grok Nation, like Stranger in a Strange Land.
Very
Grok?
good, yes.
We'll get into it.
He seemed to think women held some type of mysterious quality that made them alien to men. But in his defense, he always tried to get women, ultimately going so far in the novel, Time Enough for Love, to explore what happens when an old rich man puts himself forward for an experimental brain transplant and ends up in the body of a young female. Anyway, there's a lot of fair criticism of how Heinlein depicted female characters. For some of his novels, Heinlein believed in a strong world government and advocated corporal punishment and the importance of military superiority. But he was also a proponent of free love, a fearless social libertarian. And this leads me to the book that I recommend as a must-read novel by Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land, published in 1961. For those who are interested in the history of science fiction, this is an incredibly important piece of work. It was the first science fiction novel ever to be listed on the New York Times bestseller list. It was the breakthrough moment for science fiction. It was also one of the inspirations to the countercultural movement of the hippies. Now, I read Heinlein first in middle school with his juvenile science fiction, Red Planet, Star Beast, and I love Star Beast, and Podcast of Mars. So when I went to high school, of course I picked up the first Heinlein book I saw in the library, which was Stranger in a Strange Land, and it really blew me away. Now, many science fiction authors set their stories in the same fictional universe, a world-building project that encompasses all their novels. Most famous is probably Larry Niven's Known Space, or C.J. Cherry's Alliance Union universe. Now, Heinlein was one of the first, if not the first, to do this. In his juvenile science fiction that I just mentioned, everything takes place in the same world-building universe, humans on Mars, sharing Mars with native Martians. Now, Stranger in a Strange Land takes place in that world-building project of Heinlein, but it takes place when man first landed on Mars, and the first expedition that went to Mars disappears. The second expedition arrives 2 decades later, and they find one survivor, Valentine Michael Smith, who was born on Mars and raised by Martians. He wasn't one of the original astronauts, he was the progeny of 2 of the astronauts. And he is brought back to Earth, where he is a stranger in a strange land. Now, Michael is enlightened from the teachings of the Martians, which pits him against the religion and the consumerism and the social constructs of humanity. So it's an important book, not just in relation to science fiction. It was included in the Library of Congress's exhibition of books that shaped America. So think about that. The next classic science fiction author that is a must-read is Isaac Asimov, one of the most prolific writers ever. He has published over 500 books, and he is considered one of the big 3 science fiction authors that came out of the golden age of science fiction. Again, that was Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke. I personally think Asimov had the greatest impact on science fiction of any science fiction writer, beginning with the 3 Laws of Robotics, going to psychohistory in the Foundation trilogy. But I'm going to recommend a novel that I recently heard the stripped cover lit guys discussing, which I remember reading in high school and thinking it had the most amazing depictions of aliens I'd ever come across. And that novel was called The Gods Themselves, published in 1972. And the title is part of a larger quotation from some obscure play. The whole quotation is, "Against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain," which is a marvelous saying, and I've never forgotten it, and may have used it a couple times myself. As you can imagine, there's a lot of social commentary on the stupidity of humankind in the novel. But it is the aliens who are the stars of this novel, in my opinion. They are so alien, so different, so non-humanoid that they'll stick with you as an example of what aliens ought to be. The closest I've come to being amazed by aliens is Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. The Gods Themselves is a standalone novel, there's no sequel, and it won both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards. Now, the third person who was the big 3, along with Asimov and Heinlein, was, of course, Arthur C. Clarke, who you probably know from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, ironically, 2001: A Space Odyssey is probably the worst book he ever wrote, something that Pints and Paperback found out. Now, Clarke was called the prophet of the space age, and he predicted the telecommunication satellites, he predicted the internet, he predicted the personal computer, personal online shopping, and so on. But if there's only one novel you ever read by Arthur C. Clarke, it has to be Childhood's End, published in 1953. It is arguably his best novel, and even Clarke considered it his personal favorite of his own novels. The story is about Earth being visited by aliens who call themselves the Overlords. They stop the Cold War, they bring peace to humanity, and wherever you think this story is going from there, you are probably wrong. I still remember how shocked I was when I found out what the Overlords look like. I hope you check out this seminal science fiction novel. The last novel I want to recommend is also from one of the Golden Age authors Frederik Pohl. He was one of those authors known for his short stories during the Golden Age, but he didn't really cement himself as a novelist until 1977, when he blew everyone away, including me, with his novel Gateway. Gateway won all the awards. All of the awards. The Campbell, the Hugo, the Locust, the Nebula. The concept of the book is really amazing. There is a long-lost alien civilization called the Hichi, who left artifacts all over the universe. Gateway is a human space station built on a Hichi asteroid, and some lucky people can win a lottery to ride a Hichi spacecraft, which may or may not lead you to an artifact far away. And it may or may not be of any value. And you may or may not be able to return with the artifact back to Earth. But if you are very lucky, you could become very rich by returning with a Hichi artifact that is of some use. The story is told from the point of view of a man named Robin Broadhead, who has been on one of these trips and who we find on a psychoanalyst's couch. And the story is told in flashback as Robin recounts what happened to him on his trip on the Hichi spaceship. It has everything great science fiction should have. A great concept, a fast-paced story, and characters who are flawed and irresistible. Those are my 5 picks of must-read classic science fiction. I'll have affiliate links below in the description if you are interested. And there are more Golden Age authors I have read, and I could recommend more books. So if you are interested to see a part 2, let me know in the comments as well. Now, I do promise I'm going to do a video of early women science fiction authors, but until then, may all the books you read be blessed.